So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to session 5 in the Climate Action and Sustainability Lunchtime Lecture webinar series. Thanks once again for all of you who are continuing to join, or for those who have joined for the first time. You're very welcome, and I hope you can join us for not just today's session, but throughout the series. We have many more ongoing. We've just completed part 1. Which completed last week, and we're into part 2 of 3 in our series. We're asking our colleagues within Trinity, leading academics, to share knowledge and perspectives on addressing national and global challenges around climate action and sustainability. As always, we record our sessions, and we upload them into our university YouTube channel, so they will be available to you, whether you can attend live or want to watch back, or can't attend but are registered. You'll get access and links and details of those sessions as we release them following our webinars. So even if you can't attend, if you're registered, you'll be able to get access to it and find your way to source those great recordings. So just as always, these 2 slides, I'd like to thank Jane for incorporating them into her slides. I suppose is to try and contextualize climate action within the national kind of priorities that are defined in the Climate Action Plan for 2023, and indeed our Sustainable Development Goals, more internationally focused, because I think every one of our speakers have a unique contribution to addressing those challenges. And so it's a nice kind of way to start the session, just to remind ourselves, what are we doing in our work that's contributing to national and international goals. And indeed, as I mentioned, I'm very delighted to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Jane Stout, who's our Vice Provost for Biodiversity and Climate Action in Trinity, and very much is at the forefront of this topic, and represent a kind of a leader in our university in this space. And our talk, I think your title, Jane, very short and simple, but very much the reality, nature and crisis. So for those of you who are new to it, please do add your questions into the chat or Q&A throughout the session. We'll come to you at the end. You can raise your hand, ask questions. I really hope it'll be a nice dialogue at the end. But as for me, I'm going to stop and hand over control to Jane. And Jane, for the next half hour or so, I'll let you share your experiences and your under this topic of nature and crisis. Thank you very much, Jane, and welcome.
Great, thanks very much, John, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll just share my screen there now. Great. Okay, so yes, short and sweet, my title, Nature in Crisis. What I want to talk about this afternoon is what's happening in nature, why it's a problem, and what we can do about it. And I'll sort of sprinkle through that some of the research that's happening in my group at the moment. So as John said in the introduction there, I'm Trinity's Vice President for Biodiversity and Climate Action, but my research, with my research hat on, I'm an ecologist, and my research spans a range of areas, some of them indicated here in this word cloud, but I'm very much interested in the interactions between people and nature, particularly pollinators, bees and other pollinators have been my study subject for the last couple of decades. And I've been looking at these interactions in nature at a variety of levels. So from individuals, so how individual insects, individual bees choose which flowers to feed from and the characteristics of those flowers, all the way up to communities and landscapes, and what's going on at those kind of scales in terms of ecological processes. But I'm really interested in how what we do as humans influences these ecological interactions, and how what they do in their interactions benefits us. So this interplay between biodiversity and ecological systems and human societies. And the main purpose for my research really is to provide the evidence base for action. So until we understand the complexity of ecosystems and the issues that are affecting ecosystems, it's very hard to design effective action at both policy and a practical level. And we need effective action. So the environmental community has been aware that nature's in crisis for a long, long time. So in fact, the Union of Concerned Scientists formed in 1969, and in 1992, so 30 years ago, 1,700 scientists from around the world made this, published this paper, which was a warning to humanity about the state of nature. Then roll on 25 years later, nearly 15,000 scientists made a second warning and published this second notice to humanity. And that's because things weren't getting any better. And you can see in these little graphs on the slide, the trends up to 1992 are in the faint line, and then the bold line is from 1992 to 2017. And you can see the trends in all of these things are continuing in the same direction. So we've got ongoing decrease in fresh water resources, so per person, we've decreases in total area of forest, decreases in abundance of vertebrates, increases in temperature, increases in CO2 emissions, and increases in both human and ruminant livestock populations. So the reason that this is a problem, I suppose, is because it is getting worse. And I've used these climate stripes and these biodiversity stripes to illustrate that. So I don't know how familiar you are with these climate stripes, but climatologist Ed Hawkins developed them to demonstrate the long-term increase in global average temperatures for 1850 on the left-hand side of the graphic through to 2018, the red on the right-hand side of the graphic. And so this shows this gradual warming of the planet globally. And this inspired Miles Richardson to create a similar graphic to visualize the loss of biodiversity from 1970. So this is based on a Living Planet index. And the green shows bigger populations and the gray smaller populations. And I'll come into a bit more detail on that biodiversity loss in a moment. So it is getting worse. Climate change is getting worse. Biodiversity loss is getting worse. And it's finally being recognized as a risk to economy and society. So this is the World Economic Forum, a figure from the Global Risks Report published in January 2023. And you see the top 4 risks in terms of severity over the next 10 years are all related to climate change and biodiversity loss. So we'll come back to this idea of risks and dependencies again later on. So this is the kind of the general context. But I suppose before we get into it, let's step back a little bit and explore what biodiversity and climate change are and how they impact us. And biodiversity is sometimes a difficult concept for people to get their heads around. So scientists define it very precisely as the variety of life, so the variety of ecosystems or habitats, so grasslands and upland bogs and urban meadows, freshwater systems, coastal systems. All of these different ecosystems are part of our biodiversity. There's also then the variety of species, so all the different plants, animals, and microorganisms that live in these habitats, and then the biodiversity or the variety among individuals within a species. So it's that genetic level of diversity. So that's how biodiversity is defined by scientists. To everyone else, it's just the living part of nature. So when we think about biodiversity, it's just that diversity in living nature. And I suppose the first thing to say is it's wonderful and fascinating and hugely inspiring. And there's something intangibly great about nature and the diversity of nature, but it's also really, really important to us. And unfortunately, it's being lost. So we're gradually losing biodiversity, we're gradually losing nature as we chip away at nature for development, for infrastructure, for housing, for farming. And this is leaving us with these homogenized or simplified landscapes where we've lost that diversity. So we've lost the biodiversity of habitats, and with that diversity of habitats, we've lost some of the biodiversity of the variety of species that live there. So if you think about rural Ireland a few decades ago, there were patches of woodlands, streams, dense hedgerows, but in some places now a lot of that's been lost as a result of the intensification and mechanization of agriculture, because of perverse incentives, because of urban population growth, and all of these things slowly have chipped away at our biodiversity. And it's not just happening here in Ireland. This is something that's happening globally. And a global report published in 2019 concluded that 3/4 of the land area of Earth is very significantly altered by human activity. that 2/3 of the oceans are experiencing increasing impacts, and that more than 85%, so nearly all of wetlands globally, have been destroyed. And these are really sobering statistics. So these impacts, these small, almost silent losses of biodiversity are being replicated worldwide. And in terms of species loss, you might have seen this statistic, a 69% decline in animal populations since the early 1970s. So this is a massive decline in the numbers of wild vertebrate animals in my own lifetime. And across all species, it's been estimated that of the 8 million species on the planet, 1 million of those species are threatened with extinction. So that's 1 million species that have taken several millions, hundreds of millions years sometimes to evolve, are being lost in a few short decades. And the result of the loss and degradation of habitats in Ireland has been a loss of species level diversity here as well. So in Ireland, we have about 31,500 species, and yet the conservation status of only about 10% of those species has been assessed. And of those species that have been assessed, what we find is that 1 in 5 species are at risk of extinction. So I just said globally there, 1 in 8 species. In Ireland, 1 in 5 species. So we're really not doing very well in terms of our species and the risk of those species to extinction. And you might have seen last week on the news, there was a report about native plants in Ireland, and this was on the back of the publication of this plant atlas just published last week. And what it concluded is that over half of Irish native plant species, so 56%, have declined in range and abundance, or both. So over half of our plant species in decline. And it's native grassland plants that have suffered the most, as well as some wetland species, plants of lakes and wetlands. And this seems incredible when you look at the background to the slide that they have up here. Most of Ireland is covered in grassland, and a lot of Ireland is very wet. So why is it that our grassland plants and our wetland plants are particularly at risk? And the problem is the way those grasslands are managed. Most of our grasslands are highly managed, single species swards, heavily managed, doused with agrochemicals. These agrochemicals wash off into the lakes and the wetlands. And so here we are. So we have a problem with biodiversity loss here in Ireland. And the main drivers of that biodiversity loss, both here in Ireland and globally, are, as I've mentioned, loss of habitat and conversion of habitats, or clearance of habitats, pollution from industry, from waste. We're all familiar with plastic pollution, but also agrochemicals and pollution through agrochemical runoff. Overexploitation, so this is overhunting and overfishing, which basically means taking individuals out of a population at a faster rate than the populations can replace themselves. So you think about this in economic terms, it's demand outstripping supply. And even though the biosphere can regenerate, we need to give it time to do that. Also invasive species, so these are new arrivals that can cause damage, disease, degradation, and of course climate change. And all of these things are driven by our agricultural systems, our extraction of resources, the spread of urbanization, but ultimately they're driven by increasing populations, overconsumption, the inefficient way we use resources, and as well our institutions and governance. So why does it matter? Why, when we look out of the window in the morning, we see green, we know there's still nature present in Ireland, we hear the birds. Why is this loss of diversity important? Well, diversity at every level is important to both functioning of ecosystems and to us as a society, to our health, our well-being, and our economies. So, for example, habitat diversity is important for biogeochemical cycles, for climate regulation, for creating the landscapes that we enjoy. Species diversity improves ecological functions like pollination, production, so biomass production, but it also improves resistance to physical and biotic stresses and changes. And genetic diversity makes populations of these species more resistant, more resilient, and more able to cope with the environmental changes that are occurring. So this idea that, yes, nature is important, but actually diversity in nature important is something it's a difficult concept to grasp. And even if we look at some of my own research across a whole range of different types of sites in Ireland, and we look at, as I said, my research is focused very much on plant-pollinator interactions. If we look at the structure of these interactions, and these graphs just show interactions between individual species of insects on the top and plants on the bottom, what we find, if we look across different habitats and we compare with other island ecosystems, we found that Irish highly managed habitats, so the agricultural, the urban habitats, are more at risk because they're supporting a lower diversity of species. So the structure of the ecosystems, the structure of those ecological interactions are more at risk because of this low species diversity. And the bottom line is that these ecosystems and our biodiversity is our life support system. So nature is fundamental to human life. It provides the air we breathe, the water and the food that sustains us, the materials that we use for shelter and for protecting us against the elements. But it's also important for our health. It provides us with medicinal compounds, for example, detoxification of poisons. It also provides protection against natural hazards like floods and soil erosion. And it contributes to spirituality, to culture, provides recreation and leisure opportunities. It gives us our luxuries, cosmetics, textiles, important things like chocolate and coffee. And so biodiversity and the natural systems and healthy ecosystems that support this biodiversity are really fundamental to humanity. And all of these benefits to humanity and our societies that come from these systems are known as ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people. And some of these contributions are fundamental to life. So for example, in this little figure here, the ones at the bottom in brown, production of oxygen, cycling of nutrients, maintenance and functioning of soils, all of these things are absolutely fundamental to us even being here and surviving on this planet. Some of these these ecosystem services or these contributions are goods, so like food, water, raw materials and medicines, so shown on this diagram in blue. Others are essential for our well-being, so shown here in yellow, so our mental and physical health, education, nice places to live. And then finally in green, we have those contributions or those ecosystem services that help to regulate the planet. And this includes climate regulation, pest regulation, disease regulation, filtering out pollutants, providing clean water. So biodiversity means, one, that we're able to exist, but two, it contributes directly and indirectly to human health and provides these goods and services on which we depend. But also, you know, there are other reasons that biodiversity is important. It's not all about what we use and what we take from biodiversity. There are other reasons why it's important. It has an inherent value as well. So the gradual and incremental loss of biodiversity, loss of habitats, loss of species, loss of genetic diversity in smaller populations, means that the supply of these benefits, these ecosystem services, these contributions from nature slow down. And the worry is that they could slow down to a point where they stop. So that's why we're concerned about loss of nature, loss of biodiversity. So chuck in a bit of climate change. So how does this biodiversity crisis line up with the all too familiar climate crisis? And I probably don't need to explain what this graph shows, but we know the climate crisis is this gradual increase in global temperatures. And it's shown, I've shown the climate stripes here for Ireland, relative to an average from 1971 to 2000. The temperatures in the last 2 decades have been considerably warmer. And the most recent IPCC Working Group 1 report stated that we're likely to exceed the 1.5 degree warming in the early 2030s, so in the next 10 years. And the Working Group 2 report states that this is enough, or if we have this 1.5 degree warming and it's sustained, this is enough to cause irreversible damage to biodiversity and ecosystems. And we've already started to see these changes in Ireland. So the current increase of temperature of just over 1 degree is already impacting nature, our infrastructures, our livelihoods. We see more frequent and severe climate extreme events, so heat waves, droughts, flooding. They're caused by climate change or made more likely by climate change. And loss of biodiversity affects our ability to cope with these changes. So biodiversity can help to slow carbon release in the first place. So bogs like this one, this is Liffey Head bog, are fantastic carbon sinks. So they retain carbon and prevent it from being lost into the atmosphere. They also act like giant sponges, and they hold rainwater and release it slowly, and that helps to prevent against flooding as well. And they provide habitat for plants and animals like birds that need these wild open spaces. So bogs are pretty amazing in terms of both biodiversity and climate. But biodiversity can also help us, as well as slowing down the release of carbon in the first place, can help us cope with or adapt to warmer climates. So coastal wetlands can help protect against storm surges. Wooded floodplains can attenuate floodwater. Vegetation holds soil together and prevents erosion and soil loss. In urban areas, street trees can help cities to deal with high temperatures in the summer. And diversity in these natural ecosystems, this biodiversity, gives these systems resilience. So ecologists have done a lot of work looking at the relationship between diversity and how ecosystems work. And generally, it's seen that if there are more species, if there's more diversity in the system, then the system's more adaptable in the face of change, and it can bounce back from these extreme events more effectively. And all of this is important in terms of our futures, in terms of our ability to develop more sustainable societies. And in fact, it's been suggested that we can't achieve the Sustainable Development Goals because we need to protect the biosphere, because these biosphere goals, biodiversity, tackling biodiversity loss and climate change, and really achieving those goals are really fundamental to underpinning achievement of all the other goals. So this slide here is a reimagining of the SDGs, not as a list of 17 global goals, but as these nested goals. So we have to achieve the biosphere goals because they underpin our societal goals, they underpin our economic goals. And remember, the economy is embedded within the biosphere, not separate to it. So to achieve sustainable societies, we do need sustainable natural systems. And it's hard from a commercial point of view, it's often hard to see how, businesses find it hard to see how their activities relate to nature. But if you think about it, all business activities have impacts on biodiversity and nature directly or indirectly, from the inputs, so materials, fuels, water, land use, etc. Those inputs or the extraction of those raw materials may have an impact on nature, and the outputs from business in terms of emissions or waste, these can also have impacts on nature. So all businesses, regardless of what they're doing, have an impact on nature. And also all businesses, regardless of what they're doing, depend on nature. And again, it's difficult to see sometimes, often it's indirect, but all sectors rely on inputs from nature, directly or indirectly. So these twin crises in nature of biodiversity loss and climate change are real risks to our economies and to our societies. So the question is, what do we do? What can we do to address these crises? And there's been an awful lot of attention and a societal awakening to the issue of climate change, and a lot of attention on climate action, and most people are familiar with this. But addressing climate change shouldn't be at the risk of further damage to biodiversity. We can't just focus on carbon emissions. And I love this graphic here, which shows this carbon tunnel vision. It's actually quite dangerous. There's lots of issues that need addressing at the same time. We do need to meet our carbon emissions targets. We need to reduce carbon emissions, but we can't do that at the expense of all these other issues. We have responsibilities to address pollution, water, land use, biodiversity, these environmental issues, but also societal issues like inequality and poverty. So when we're looking into climate action, we need to make sure we look beyond just carbon. And there can be potentially win-wins for biodiversity and climate. So it's not that taking action for climate and biodiversity should be considered separately, but the two need to be considered together. So for example, things like restoration of ecosystems or afforestation with native trees, these could present win-wins for both biodiversity and for tackling climate change. And that's the focus of some of my current ongoing research. So I'll just describe some of our current projects that are looking at these issues. So, for example, starting off with forestry, can planting native forestry be a biodiversity and climate win-win? And this is the topic of two of my current ongoing projects, so the 4ES project and the Forest project. And these are examining the multiple values of native forestry and trying to develop solutions that are truly sustainable, so socially, economically, and ecologically sustainable. And these are multidisciplinary research projects. And what we're trying to do is to develop practical tools for foresters to aid decision-making. We're investigating the financial incentives that are necessary to encourage afforestation with native species. But we're also looking at how afforestation affects local communities. So that whole idea that we need to look at both the ecological system, but the social system and the economics as well. Sorry, I think I just skipped a slide note. Another one of my projects is focusing on agriculture. So can there be win-wins for climate and biodiversity and still have productive agricultural systems? Well, one option that we're exploring as part of the Farm Zero C project is multi-species swards. And the idea here is that if you have multiple species in your grassland, rather than just a single species of grass, if you've multiple species, then there's more protein, more minerals for the grazers, there's more resilience to drought and flooding because we've got these different rooting patterns, these different resistances between the different species. These communities sequester and store more carbon. We get a better soil structure from the different rooting of the different species. Different fungal associations using to more efficient nutrient use. If we've got legumes in the mix, then they have nitrogen fixing bacteria. This decreases the need for artificial nitrogen input and increases the fertility of the soil. If we've got a diversity of plants, then we get a diversity of decomposers. We get more nutrient cycling, more biocontrol, etc., etc. So these multi-species swards could really represent a win-win for climate, for biodiversity, but also for productivity in agricultural systems. And so an MSc student, Sarah, you see her picture here, Sarah Austin, looked at the benefits of multi-species swards for pollinators in collaboration with my postdoc there, Kian. And what they found was that there were more pollinators in multi-species swards compared with ryegrass or ryegrass and clover swards, but farmers did describe them as being difficult to manage in terms of balancing the productivity of the grasses and the forbs, and really a lack of information. So we're starting to understand how we can change activity on farmland, but there's a lot still to do. In terms of renewable energies, onshore wind is currently the main renewable energy source in Ireland. There could be win-wins for climate and biodiversity here, depending on where the wind farms are sited and how they're managed for nature. So there can be quite devastating consequences for nature if the turbines are sited in inappropriate places. So, for example, on some peatland sites, this can contribute to bog bursts, etc. But if they're on suitable sites, they're integrated into other well-managed ecosystems, then wind farms could have positive impacts on biodiversity. And this is something we're currently looking at in the Nature Plus Energy project with the wind industry as part of the SFI Mariai Centre, and researchers on that project there are Emma and Courtney, shown in the pictures. And finally then solar. The Climate Action Plan goal is to increase the solar capacity massively in Ireland. And if we do that, we need an awful lot of land if we're going to do that through these kind of solar farms. And of course, this could have biodiversity impacts. As I said earlier, our native grasslands are some of the most threatened habitats and some of the most threatened species. So long as new solar farms aren't sited on the fragments of natural grasslands that are left, if they are managed to improve biodiversity, there could be a win-win. And again, this is something that's currently being researched by PhD student Roisin Gowan, and her primary supervisor is Sarah McCormack, shown in the pictures there. And this is part of the E3 Forest project as well. So that's just some of our ongoing research, and this and how it aligns with the ambitions of the Climate Action Plan. So I've taken a quote there from the Climate Action Plan, that the ultimate objective of achieving a transition to a climate resilient, biodiversity rich and carbon neutral economy no later than 2050. So it's there in the Climate Action Plan that we need to include and consider biodiversity. But is this enough? A recent report from the Joint Committee on Environment and Climate Action recommended that the government put in place an emergency plan to address biodiversity loss. So these are very strong words coming from the Oireachtas on this, is that we can't just say, yeah, we want to have nice biodiversity, and wouldn't that be lovely if we can achieve that alongside carbon goals. It's saying we actually need to do something proactive. We need an emergency plan. We need to go, we need to do something very significant to address biodiversity loss. And this aligns with international plans. So the global framework for biodiversity was agreed at COP15 just before Christmas. So people are familiar with COP in terms of the climate COPs, but there's a parallel series of COPs for biodiversity, and COP15 ran there just before Christmas. And the agreement at COP15 has been described as the Paris moment for nature. So it was an agreement on targets to put nature on a path to recovery by 2030. So there's conservation targets for 30% of terrestrial and aquatic areas to be conserved, and for 30% of degraded ecosystems to be restored. There's also plans to reduce harmful subsidies and harmful incentives. So it's a really significant framework, but it remains to be seen how it will be implemented and whether it will make the difference that's needed. We've had biodiversity targets in 2000, in 2010, in 2020. How are we going to make it? How are we actually going to get there by 2030? It really needs a big effort by everyone. And we need a real nature-first approach to everything we do. It's not a nice to have at the end. It's something we need to think about at the beginning. So we need to protect habitats. So don't contribute to the slow chip of biodiversity loss that I mentioned earlier. We need to restore degraded habitats. We need to incorporate nature-sensitive management plans into our activities. And we need to create or recreate habitats that have been lost. We need to do this carefully. So, for example, with habitat creation, we need to make sure that it actually provides a solution to biodiversity loss and that it's not creating more problems. So, for example, creating a wildflower meadow with an inappropriate seed mix can actually introduce invasive species. It can create artificial communities and not contribute to biodiversity targets at all. So we need this nature-first approach, but we need to do it with some understanding of that nature and some understanding of the complexities therein. And as I said, I work on pollinators, and one of the things that I was involved in is co-founding the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan back in 2015. And this is an action plan that enables people to take action to reverse decline in bees and other pollinating insects and our wider biodiversity across farmland, public land and private land across the island of Ireland. And the reason I mention it is that the thing about biodiversity conservation is that it can't just be done in one place or by one sector. We need everybody to get on board. And the Pollinator Plan has been really successful in doing this through providing tailored guidance and sectoral specific guidance and advice that can be implemented across a range of situations. So for businesses, for local communities and local authorities, gardeners, schools, religious properties, transport corridors, etc., etc. So I think there are opportunities for action across sectors, across scales, and for everybody to get involved, but often it's hard to know where to start. And so the Pollinator Plan's really provided a focal point of how to get started. And that's one of the questions that I get asked most often. What can individuals do to make a difference? It's such a massive issue. What can people do to address the crises in nature? And so this infographic really just summarizes 4 things that everybody can get involved in. So the first one is reducing consumption. So not buying stuff we don't need, to reuse and recycle stuff that we no longer need. To try and support more sustainable food systems, so having less meat and dairy in our diets, more plant-based proteins. This can reduce the area needed for food production globally, or you could grow your own food if you have green fingers. Cutting pollution, so using less disposable plastics, walking or cycling for local journeys rather than getting into the car. So, you know, individuals can play a part. And conservation or restoration in your local area. So play your part in conserving biodiversity in your local where you live or where you work. And one way that people have got engaged and are doing this is through the Pollinator plan that I just mentioned. So I'm going to finish off with the 2 slides that John asked me to include in reference to how my research addresses climate action. So I think I've just described that in terms of looking at the interaction between increasing renewable energy, looking at farming systems, looking at businesses and enterprises, looking at our land use, and how these things all interact with either the loss, the protection, or the restoration of biodiversity. And when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, as I said, I think healthy ecosystems underpin all of the goals. So I've highlighted all of them. I mean, most of my research focuses on life on land, but as I say, that underpins all these other goals. So I've highlighted all of the global goals and would like to claim that my research contributes to all of these things because they're all interconnected. So I will finish by saying that nature is in crisis. We can all contribute to the solution. And if you are in Dublin next week, it's Trinity's Green Week, and we have a whole range of events for staff, students, alumni, members of the public. So please check out the full schedule by scanning the QR code, and I hope to see you at some of those events. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. And we may leave that slide up for a minute or 2 to ensure people can avail of the QR code. So thanks for promoting that. I think it's a great series of events taking place next week. We have a few questions that come in on the chat, but I must encourage people to raise their hand. There was a raised hand, but it's disappeared now. But if you raise your hand, I'll invite you to ask your question directly to Jane. But Jane, some people are kind of asking questions about, I suppose, different environments and different settings, and your view on them. That seems to be the theme of a few of the questions so far. So, for example, Mark, in his first question that came in, was about blueways, and but developing them in a balanced manner. I think maybe you can see the questions, but there is an aspect of and I work in this space as well, of people enjoying the space. So nature enjoyment and well-being versus losing, I suppose, the loss of riparian zones as he places it. So where's your thoughts on blueways and greenways as well, perhaps in a broader sense, in terms of how your work informs good design?
Great, thanks very much for the question, Mark. And I think it's the key words there in your question are balance. You know, it's when we're making decisions about how to manage land or water or you know, whatever areas that we're trying to manage, it's about that balance. So it's also taking a kind of a large scale view as well. And I think this is where making decisions can be quite difficult, because it might be that in some places, the value of that blueway for mental and physical health for people outweighs the potential value of that area for biodiversity. In other places, it might be that it's the biodiversity value is much higher than the value to people. So it's about that balance. I mean, it would be great if we could develop these in such a way that they benefit both biodiversity and people. That would be the ideal. And so, you know, you do see in some of the greenways, they've done a really nice job of blending benefit for biodiversity with benefit for people and enjoyment of those areas. But in other places, it's very difficult to do that. So I think balance is important. We can't underestimate the importance of experiencing nature for human, mental and physical health, but also for developing that connectivity with nature that most of the population has lost. So the ability to get into nature and to use nature and get close to it and to appreciate it and enjoy it and learn about it and be curious about it and get excited about it, and all of those things are really, really important in meeting these targets of nature protection. Because if people don't care, if people don't have some kind of emotional connection to nature, then it could just become another tick box. It could just be something that's a nice to have at the bottom of the list. So I think as far as I'm concerned, it's all about balance, and it's weighing up those pros and cons in a sensible and a structured way. And this is what we're trying to do actually in the forest project that I was talking about. The 4ES project is trying to develop a tool for decision making that enables all of those different benefits to be quantified and weighed up alongside each other. So that's how we're addressing it in the research. But I do think the key thing is balance.
Yeah, it's a key word, I think, and a lot comes through in a lot of our speakers' talks about through the series. Catherine has a question, Jane, in relation, I suppose, maybe it's something that's personal to me as well. If you have a city garden, or maybe your own private garden, as well, good planting, it could positively impact the natural system, but not necessarily address biodiversity. What's your lessons maybe to share in that perspective, how to get it right?
Yeah, that's a great question, Catherine, because it's lots of people want to do this, as you say, and we're in the same situation here on our campus in Trinity. Is what can we do that actually benefits biodiversity? So remember, biodiversity is about variety. So if you're planting a variety of things in your garden, then you are providing biodiversity. Not natural, but it is diversity of life. But what you're also doing, if you're planting native species, if your planting is providing a food resource for insects or birds, then you are supporting the native biodiversity that's in cities. And even if you've only got a tiny little patch of garden, Dublin and many other cities are quite green, and these little patches make networks that together can support native biodiversity. So I work on, as I said, on bees, on pollinators, and they're very mobile, but they do need this network of green spaces in order to forage, in order to find the right places to nest. The birds that feed on the insects need places to nest. So we need that variety in our urban areas. So I think I suppose the wrong thing to do is for everybody's garden to look exactly the same. That wouldn't be biodiversity. But if you've got a garden, you make it look nice for you, you think about nature, you don't use chemicals, you try and leave some space for nature in terms of native plants, or not mowing an area, or leaving an area a little bit wild, or then you do provide some biodiversity benefit. But it's a really good question. And I think biodiversity, the difficult thing about making recommendations for biodiversity is that it's really context specific. So you kind of need to make the decisions that are right for wherever you are and wherever your garden is and how big your garden is. So it's very hard to make sweeping generalizations, but I think that sort of network of green sites can be beneficial for biodiversity in an urban context.
I'm just going to segue to another question, but I'll address questions prior, so forgive me for those just to jump. But on that very point, I suppose in your current VP hat or Vice Provost hat, someone asked Martin asks about, as a university, addressing challenges in nature and crisis and climate crisis. What's your vision, I suppose, given that your role's quite new as well, as to Trinity's role as an institute?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I don't know if I've got enough time to tell you everything that's in my vision, but I think one thing we can do as a university, as an institution of research and education, is to do those things, is to do the research, to understand what's going on in nature, to understand the solutions, to understand the issues, to cut across the disciplines. We're a university with lots of different disciplines. We need to work together for real sustainable decision making. So that's one thing we do, is the research, and then transfer the knowledge and the understanding from that research, not just into academic papers, but into policy and into practice. And the other thing as an educational institution is we have an opportunity and a responsibility to educate the next generation in terms of the nature crisis. And so what we're trying to develop is a way to embed these issues in the curriculum at undergraduate and postgraduate level, to increase education and increase knowledge and awareness and understanding among our staff, among our alumni, among our visitors. You know, so there's a lot of what we can do in terms of education. And of course, then there's what we actually do practically as an organization in our day-to-day operations. So we can look at where our biggest impacts are, try to reduce those impacts, and try and do something positive in the spaces, the buildings, the green spaces, in terms of what we actually do as a university. And because as a university, especially where we are here in Trinity, in the middle of Dublin, we're not working in isolation. Everyone around us is trying to address these challenges as well. So we need to work in partnership with our neighbours, the local communities, the local businesses, because we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to address this together. So the strategy or the vision, I think for Trinity, from my point of view, is that we will become a nature positive university. So address these crises through research, education, what we do day to day, and through partnership with others as well. That's the potted summary.
Thanks, Jane. And there's a comment from Justin, but I might then follow it up with a question from Becky. So Justin's comment was, it was good to see that economy and society are subsets of the environment, and indeed sustainability is those three together anyway. So it's good to highlight that point again. But given actually the second question from Becky, she's an organic farmer. How can she? Well, she wants to connect with academics about managing wetlands on her farm. But it's an interesting one, because as a business, as a farmer, you know, you have to balance economy, social, environment, all of those things together. So I think Justin's comment very well noted. But Becky, have you any kind of thoughts on how Becky can, I suppose, explore suitable information around managing her wetlands?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it is hard to get that balance, isn't it? And in terms of practical management of wetlands, I'm trying to think if there's any particular people that come to mind. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. Yeah, there are different ways to measure wetlands. It depends what kind of wetlands they are, and whether they're part of the productive part of the farm or not. So maybe Becky, you can come back to me afterwards, and I might be able to help with a bit more detail. There's a lot of research happening in Trinity and elsewhere on how to best manage farmland for biodiversity, but yeah, it's difficult without knowing more about what kinds of wetlands you have to make an answer.
Perfect, Jane. Thank you for offering to allow Becky to connect with you on that. Just one last question in the chat, and I don't see any others in the hand, so this might be your final question. So from David. Hi, Jane. What can you do to help? Suggestions are great for individuals, but how can these changes be made systematically in Ireland? So that's kind of part one. And then secondly, how can the crisis in nature be provided at the same level of global attention as the acknowledged climate crisis? So I suppose it's getting the balance there as well. So what can you do to help as individuals? But what about the systematic approach for Ireland in this space, first of all?
Thanks, David. I suppose they're kind of key questions, aren't they? What can we do systematically in Ireland? So, I mean, it's kind of top down and bottom up. So we need policy alignment. We need policies that are more connected, integrated, and are well enforced. So there are changes coming down the line. So the CSRD, the directive for corporates for reporting came into force this year. So that will push corporates to consider their impacts and to report on their impacts. So that's a start. In terms of restoration and protection of nature, in terms of policy, there's a nature restoration law coming down the line. That's going to be a game changer. That's massive. It's going to be really, really hard to implement, and it's going to require everyone working together, and it's going to require some consideration of the way that individuals and organizations are incentivized to take action for nature restoration. So there's some policy stuff coming down the line that will help. As I say, there's also this global biodiversity framework, but that's targets. We need action. So there's that top down, but the bottom up is really important. The suggestions for the individuals. I suppose one of the things I should have put on that list of suggestions for individuals is to push for this with the politicians, because until people are pushing for this from the bottom up, it's unlikely changes will come from the top down. So pushing as individuals can make a difference. So pushing from the bottom up, my experience is through the All Ireland Pollinator plan. That wasn't a top-down process. That was individuals on the ground going, yeah, we really need to do something. What can we do? Let's get going and try and instigate something. We've no funding. We can't offer anybody any incentives to do this, but what can we do? So there is the power of bottom up, but there is also the power of top down. So I think that's how we get these sort of systemic changes. And you're absolutely right. The crisis in nature needs to have the same level of attention as the climate crisis. I think a lot of people, when they talk about climate, actually also mean nature. And so it's kind of being clear about what we're talking about. But it's absolutely, we can't have this carbon tunnel vision where we only address carbon emissions. I mean, the climate crisis is we're going to have to adapt to it as well as mitigate the problem. And the crisis in nature does need more attention. I think people are becoming more aware. It's certainly being talked about more. And I think it's that we're missing the action of what to do. I think because biodiversity is context specific and complex, it's a bit more difficult. Carbon is carbon, wherever it is. A ton of carbon is the same wherever it is, anywhere in the world. Biodiversity is very context specific. So I think it presents a little bit more of a challenge in terms of actions and in terms of tracking changes and auditing success as well. But yeah, no, those are the golden questions that we need to answer.
Thanks, Jane. I just, for 30 seconds, I kind of want to maybe let you finish on a positive. It's been as the crisis, but is there any good news stories in an Irish context around things that are going in the right direction if we were to audit things? So just maybe to kind of finish before I kind of close out, your kind of closing comments on that.
I think the positives in Ireland is that we are starting to make progress on this. I mean, I think in terms of what's actually happening on the ground in nature, that's still a bit depressing. That's not going in the right direction yet, but we need to turn things around. And I feel that there is it's slow. It's like turning an enormous vessel that's going in one direction to go the other way. It's slow, but I feel that it's happening. So I'm still optimistic. I think if we start to recognize that everybody can play a part and that it impacts everybody and that we do still have time to make a difference, then I think that is a positive way to go.
That's great, Jane. I think so. There's a bottom up and top down progress being made then. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to close out. Thank you very much once again, Jane, for joining us this afternoon and for promoting Green Week as well. So again, thank you to Jane and to all our speakers that are contributing to this series and links. Maybe just to highlight, given that Green Week is next week, our speaker for next week is part of the Green Week series, Professor Mick Morris, about circular economy and sustainability. As clear as plastic is his title, where he'll talk about what does sustainability mean in the context of the kind of the new conceptual circular economy and how that's all going to work together. Once again, thank you very much for everyone that's joined us. As always, we will share a recording to registered participants of this session, and please sign up for future sessions and share. Thanks again, Jane, for your time. Thank you for everyone for joining, and I look forward to speaking to you or seeing you all or hearing from you all next week. Thank you and have a great day.